There's a specific kind of late-night conversation that only happens when it's past midnight, and the topic doesn't really matter, but somehow you can't stop talking about it. Someone brings up an old thing, a show, a moment, a piece of television history, and suddenly an hour has gone by and you've covered ground you had no idea you were going to cover when you started. That's kind of what this video is. The topic is Family Guy and South Park, and the strange moment in 2006 when South Park dedicated 2 full episodes of its 10th season to thoroughly, methodically, and honestly, quite lovingly dismantling Family Guy's approach to comedy. Not in a cheap way, not as a drive-by, as a genuine argument about what makes something funny, and more specifically, about what makes something meaningfully funny, rather than just reflexively funny. I've been thinking about this topic for a while, not in an obsessive way, just in the way that certain things stick in your head and you find yourself returning to them occasionally, rolling them over a bit, putting them back down. The Cartoon Wars episodes, that's what the South Park 2-parter is called, aired in April 2006, which means by the time you're watching this, they're nearly 2 decades old. And yet the argument they were making feels, if anything, more relevant now than it did then, which is either a testament to how good the critique was, or a sign that Family Guy has kept providing evidence for it ever since. Possibly both. The thing about really good criticism, whether it's of a book or a film or a television show, is that it articulates something you already sensed but couldn't quite name. You watch the Cartoon Wars episodes and there's a moment of recognition. Not just, that's funny, but that's true. The manatees selecting their balls, funny, yes, but also accurate as in a way that, once you've seen it, you can't quite unsee when you go back to watch Family Guy. Parker and Stone gave you a frame. The frame changes what you see. If you want to subscribe before we get going, it's right there. It helps more than you'd think, and I genuinely appreciate it. So, what we're going to do tonight, or this morning, or whenever you've settled in, is take a long, comfortable look at the whole thing. We'll start with the night Cartoon Wars actually aired and what it said. Then we'll go back to Family Guy's beginnings, because context matters here. We'll talk about the cancellation and the strange resurrection, and what changed when the show came back. We'll spend some time with the characters, particularly what happened to them over the years, and then we'll get into the craft argument itself, the Steelman case for Family Guy, how all of this aged, and where things stand now. No hurry, nothing to chase, just a long, easy wander through one of the more genuinely interesting arguments television comedy has had with itself. One thing I want to say up front, this isn't a video designed to convince you that Family Guy is a bad show or that you shouldn't enjoy it. If you like Family Guy, that's completely fine, and honestly, none of my business. Plenty of smart, thoughtful people like it a great deal, and there are things it does, things it has always done, that are genuinely funny and occasionally brilliant. The argument Parker and Stone made in 2006 was not, this show shouldn't exist. They were quite specific about that. They said the show could stay on the air. They just didn't respect it in terms of writing. That distinction is worth holding on to as we go through this, because it's easy to collapse the craft argument into a quality judgment, and the two things aren't quite the same. You can think a show makes questionable structural choices and still find it funny. You can agree with a critique of something's methodology while also enjoying the output. These aren't contradictions. They're just the complicated reality of how we relate to entertainment. What Parker and Stone were defending, essentially, was the idea that the structural choices a show makes have long-term consequences, that the way you decide to build comedy shapes what comedy can become over time, and that the cutaway gag model, whatever its immediate pleasures, was a choice that would compound in ways that mattered. Looking back from now, nearly 20 years later, there's a reasonable case that they were right about this. And making that case as calmly and thoroughly as I can is what the next couple of hours are for. To understand why Cartoon Wars landed the way it did, you need to remember what April 2006 actually felt like in the news. A few months earlier, September 2005, a Danish newspaper called Jyllands-Posten had published a series of editorial cartoons depicting the Prophet Muhammad. The response was significant. There were protests across multiple countries, some of which turned violent. The images circulated, the debate about press freedom and religious sensitivity got extremely loud, and by early 2006 it was genuinely one of the dominant conversations happening in Western media. Trey Parker and Matt Stone, who had been trying for a while to include an image of Muhammad in a South Park episode and being blocked by Comedy Central, saw an angle. They were going to do a two-part episode about censorship, about the Muhammad controversy, about the absurdity of burying your head in the sand, literally, as it turns out, since the residents of South Park spend much of the episode doing exactly that. And they were going to use Family Guy as the vehicle. The setup is this. South Park's townspeople learn that an upcoming episode of Family Guy is going to depict Muhammad as a character. They panic. They assume this will result in terrorist retaliation. The whole town descends into the kind of fear-based groupthink that Parker and Stone have always been particularly good at skewering. Meanwhile, Cartman, who is, depending on the episode, either the show's villain or its most accidentally honest voice, sets off to Hollywood to get the Family Guy episode cancelled. But not because he cares about offending Muslims. He just hates Family Guy. Cartman's scheme involves infiltrating the Fox network, and eventually he gets inside the Family Guy studio itself, where he is introduced to the writing room. The writing room is a tank, a large water tank full of manatees, sea mammals, placid and enormous, gliding around their enclosure. And their method of writing is this. There's a pile of plastic balls at the bottom of the tank, each one labelled with a word or phrase, a noun, a verb, a pop culture reference, a celebrity name. The manatees select balls at random and deliver them to a machine. The machine assembles the balls into a cutaway gag, and out comes an episode of Family Guy. The example the episode generates on screen: Peter winning a date in Mexico with Gary Coleman. It's a very precise joke, because it's not just random, it's recognisably Family Guy random. The words feel right for the show's register. It could genuinely be a Family Guy cutaway. That's the point. Parker and Stone weren't just saying Family Guy's jokes were random, they were saying the randomness had a specific replicable character that could be reproduced by a machine or by manatees, and you wouldn't be able to tell the difference. Kyle's role in the two episodes is worth paying attention to, because he functions as the moral counterweight to Cartman. Kyle argues that Family Guy should be allowed to air the Muhammad episode on free speech grounds. And he's right in the show's own logic. The episode isn't endorsing Cartman's crusade, it's using Cartman's crusade to make a different point. Kyle's correct position on censorship coexists with Cartman's correct position on writing. The two episodes manage to be pro-free speech and critical of Family Guy simultaneously, which is a structurally clever thing to pull off. It's also very South Park in its refusal to let a simple good guys, bad guys frame do the work. Nobody is entirely right. Nobody is entirely wrong. The argument is more interesting than the resolution. And then there's Cartman's line. He says it to Kyle, who's also ended up at the studio, and who doesn't yet know about the manatees. Cartman is explaining why he hates Family Guy so much, and he says, "When I make jokes, they are inherent to a story. Deep situational and emotional jokes based on what is relevant and has a point. Not just one random interchangeable joke after another." Which is, of course, deeply funny coming from Eric Cartman, a character who has done some of the most morally indefensible things in the history of television. He is not a reliable narrator. He is not a model of good values. But on this particular point, in this particular episode, the show is absolutely using him as its mouthpiece. The writers confirmed this on the DVD commentary. This is what they think. Cartman is just the vehicle. The broader Muhammad storyline resolves in a way that's both funny and genuinely pointed. Comedy Central censored the actual image of Muhammad even within the episode, which Parker and Stone responded to by including a title card explaining exactly what happened and why they were furious about it. The show's conclusion involves Al-Qaeda releasing a devastating retaliatory video that turns out to be a crude animated cartoon of various Americans and Jesus defecating on each other. The terrorists, watching it back, conclude that it burned the Americans, and then one of them adds that it was way funnier than Family Guy. That line is almost an afterthought. It comes right at the end, and it might be the cruelest joke in the whole two-parter. Seth MacFarlane, for what it's worth, was quite gracious about it. He showed up at Harvard for his class day address that June, spoke in character as Stewie, and acknowledged the criticism directly. Later, in interviews, he'd say he thought the episode was funny and accurate, which I'll come back to his full response later, because it's actually more nuanced than that summary suggests, is a remarkably even-handed thing to say about 2 episodes of television that basically called you a sea mammal. The episodes aired to solid ratings and won an IGN Editor's Choice Award. The AV Club later called them a good example of Parker and Stone's ability to satirize various forms of media, while still producing quality television despite the controversy swirling around them. They became, over time, more famous than most of the Family Guy episodes they were parodying, which is itself a kind of verdict. There's another layer to the Cartoon Wars episodes that tends to get less attention, but that I think is worth sitting with. Parker and Stone were dealing with genuine censorship pressure at exactly the same time they were making these episodes. Comedy Central refused to air an actual image of Muhammad. The episode was delivered to the network, with the scene fully animated, Stewie handing a football helmet to Muhammad, apparently a completely mundane interaction, and Comedy Central inserted a black title card in its place explaining the decision. Parker and Stone were, by their own accounts, furious. They said so in interviews, at length. The decision to criticise Family Guy within the same episodes where they were fighting their own network over censorship created an interesting juxtaposition that I don't think is accidental. Family Guy was being framed within South Park's story as a brave, principled show for being willing to air a Muhammad image. But the actual critique of Family Guy embedded in the same episodes was that its writing was shallow and disconnected from meaning. The two things sitting next to each other imply something. A show can be willing to transgress and still have nothing to say. Being willing to offend is not the same as having a point. I don't know for certain whether that was deliberate framing or a consequence of timing, but it adds a dimension to the episodes that makes them richer than just a funny bit about sea mammals selecting comedy balls. The censorship argument and the craft argument are running in parallel, and in combination they're making a claim about what courage in comedy actually looks like. It's not only being willing to show something, it's being willing to mean something. There's also the Bart Simpson cameo in Part 2. A character unmistakably based on Bart appears briefly, exchanges a few words with Cartman, and gets dismissed in a way that's more warm than hostile. The Simpsons' inclusion was not accidental. Parker and Stone had been in contact with the Simpsons writing staff, who were supportive of the critique being made, and had apparently made their feelings clear. Including the reference was a small acknowledgement, a wave toward a show they respected, placed inside an episode about a show they didn't. But before we get into what the critique actually meant, what the manatee argument was really saying about craft and structure, and what comedy is supposed to do, it helps to know a bit about why Parker and Stone cared enough to make 2 whole episodes about it. The thing that tends to get lost when people talk about the South Park Family Guy feud is that it wasn't really a feud in the traditional sense. It wasn't about ratings competition or celebrity beef. Parker and Stone were not trying to destroy Seth MacFarlane. They were trying to make a specific argument, and they made it with a very specific intensity because the comparison, the constant OU and Family Guy, 2 of the best animated shows on television comparison, was something they apparently found genuinely insulting. Trey Parker said it plainly at the time. Being told that South Park and Family Guy were peers was one of the meanest things anyone has ever said to us. That's a strong way to put it, but it points to what the actual grievance was. Parker and Stone had spent years building a show that, whatever you think of its humour or its politics or its approach to basically everything, was clearly doing something structurally specific. South Park episodes are built around a central argument. The comedy emerges from that argument being pursued through characters who have consistent, idiosyncratic personalities. When Cartman does something, it comes from Cartman's specific psychology. When Kenny dies, there's usually a reason tied to what's happening in the story. When Randy Marsh gets involved in something, his particular brand of earnest overconfidence shapes where the plot goes. The show improvises in a specific sense. Parker and Stone are famous for writing and producing episodes in a matter of days, sometimes finishing literally the night before broadcast. But the improvisation is rooted in character and story logic. The jokes emerge from the situation. They're not dropped in from outside it. And being grouped with Family Guy felt, to them, like being told that none of that mattered, that the output was the same, that if both shows were animated and adult and made jokes about inappropriate things, they were basically interchangeable. It's a bit like, and I realise this is a slightly grand comparison, but stay with me, being a chef who spent 20 years developing a particular approach to food, where every element of a dish is connected to every other element, and the whole thing is constructed around a specific idea, and then being told, oh, you and that restaurant down the road that serves frozen meals, reheated, are basically doing the same thing, aren't you? Both hot food, both comes on a plate. You'd find that galling, not primarily as a matter of ego, but because the comparison erases a distinction that you believe actually matters. Parker actually spelled out the specific complaint on the Cartoon Wars DVD commentary. He talked about the Family Guy writers being smart. He wasn't calling them stupid. He was saying they made a choice. The choice was to write jokes that functioned independently of character and story. Jokes that could be grafted onto any episode without changing anything about the episode, and to use that approach as the show's primary engine. And Parker's position was that this choice, whatever short-term comedic payoffs it produced, was fundamentally a different enterprise than what South Park was doing. His exact words about the show, "We do hate it, we do hate Family Guy, we understand that people love it, we certainly don't think it should be taken off the air, we just don't respect it in terms of writing." That's a carefully constructed sentence. It's not a dismissal of the audience, it's not a moral objection, it's a craft objection, and it's aimed specifically at the writing choices, not at Seth MacFarlane as a person, or even at the show's existence. What's interesting, and this only becomes clear if you spend some time with Parker and Stone's other interviews from around this period, is that the comparison bothered them not just as a point of pride, but because they felt it obscured something they were actually trying to do. South Park, in its better episodes, is doing something quite ambitious. It's taking a topical subject, putting it through a filter of absurdist escalation, and arriving at a genuine argument. The joke is the argument. They're not separate things. You can't extract the comedy from the point being made because the comedy is the point being made. The Cartoon Wars episodes themselves are an example of this. The Muhammad storyline isn't just a backdrop, it's the argument. Parker and Stone were genuinely furious about Comedy Central's censorship decisions. They embedded that fury into the show's structure. Cartman's fake crusade mirrors the network's real one. Kyle's defense of free speech mirrors Parker and Stone's own position. The resolution, where the retaliation turns out to be a crude cartoon of Jesus and various Americans doing terrible things to each other, which Comedy Central allowed without hesitation, makes the actual point about double standards. The joke and the argument are the same thing. You can't say the same about Peter Griffin winning a date in Mexico with Gary Coleman. That joke is complete in itself. It doesn't argue anything. It doesn't come from anywhere. It makes you laugh or it doesn't, and then it's gone. Now you might reasonably ask, so what? Why does it matter if a joke comes from somewhere? Isn't a laugh a laugh? And that's a fair question. and I'll get into the full answer a bit later on. But the short version of Parker and Stone's position is a laugh that comes from nowhere goes nowhere. It can't accumulate it into anything. It can't leave you with anything. And over the course of a 22-minute episode, or over the course of a decade of episodes, that difference adds up. There's a reason people still quote classic Simpsons episodes, word for word, 25 years later, while Family Guy moments tend to survive more as clips than as lines. The Simpsons at its best embedded its jokes so deeply in character and situation that quoting the line brings the whole moment back with it. The joke is the character is the moment. They're inseparable. Family Guy's memorable moments are largely visual or physical, which is perfectly suited to a clip economy but doesn't produce the same kind of deep familiarity. Parker and Stone were defending, essentially, the version of comedy that stays with you. The version that leaves a residue. Whether that's more valuable than the version that just makes you laugh in the moment is ultimately a personal question. But it's the argument they were making. Whether you agree with them is a separate question. But it's worth noting that when they made this argument publicly, they were not alone. The Simpsons staff sent them flowers. Here's something that doesn't get talked about as much as it should. Family Guy's first few seasons are genuinely different from what the show became. The pilot episode aired on January 31st, 1999, right after the Super Bowl, which is one of the most watched television events of the year in America. Something in the range of 22 million people watched that first episode. That's an enormous audience for any show, let alone an animated adult sitcom that nobody had heard of. Fox was betting on it, and what those 22 million people saw wasn't the Family Guy that Trey Parker and Matt Stone would spend 2 episodes dismantling 7 years later. The early version of the show had a different centre of gravity. Cutaway gags existed in season 1. They were there from the start, but they were used more sparingly, and, this is the important part, they were often still connected, at least loosely, to what was happening in the scene. A character would say something, and the cutaway would illustrate it. There was a relationship, even if it was tenuous, between the joke and the moment that prompted it. It's worth being precise about this because the early seasons of Family Guy sometimes get misremembered as being entirely free of cutaway gags, as though the format was imposed entirely by the post-cancellation return. That's not quite right. The format was there from season 1. What changed was the density and the looseness of the connection between the gags and the story. In early seasons, a cutaway might take up 30 seconds and have at least a thematic link to what preceded it. By later seasons, cutaways could run several minutes and have no connection to the episode whatsoever. The difference is degree, but the degree matters. Peter Griffin in those early episodes was dim, yes, and prone to terrible decisions, but there was still something recognisably human underneath it. He worked at a toy factory. He had friends he genuinely liked hanging out with. He loved his kids in a disorganised, slightly oblivious way. He and Lois had a marriage that had texture. She'd given up a wealthy family background to be with him. There were real stakes in that choice, and the show occasionally acknowledged them. The critical reception of that first season was mixed in a revealing way. Viewers who were coming off The Simpsons and expecting something that operated in the same register were often confused or disappointed. Critics who were willing to engage with Family Guy on its own terms found more to work with. Ken Tucker at Entertainment Weekly famously disliked it, grading it poorly and naming it one of the worst shows of the 1999 to 2000 season. Others found its irreverence fresh. The Simpsons comparison was inevitable and slightly unfair to both shows. Family Guy wasn't trying to be The Simpsons. It was trying to be something faster, rougher, less emotionally invested, more willing to be stupid. The pilot episode's opening sequence, a kind of absurdist domestic tableau that announces itself as self-aware about its own sitcomness, is clearly positioning the show as something that knows what it is and isn't particularly bothered by the comparison. There's an insouciance to early Family Guy that's separate from The Simpsons' warmth. The show was cooler, in the vernacular sense, less invested in whether you loved it. That quality, the show's particular brand of detachment, would eventually become a problem. Detachment is funny at the right distance. Too much of it, sustained over too long, produces something that feels genuinely indifferent to its audience, rather than artfully above it. There's a difference between a show that knows it's being watched and plays with that awareness, and a show that simply doesn't care. Early Family Guy had the former, later seasons drifted toward the latter. Lois herself was more interesting then. There's a backstory there that the show seeded in early episodes and then largely abandoned. Her wealthy parents, her sense of having chosen a different path from what she was raised to want, her musical ability, she was a piano teacher, a past that felt a bit more complicated than patient housewife. The show gestured toward a Lois who had layers. It didn't always follow through, but the gestures were there. Stewie in season 1 was genuinely unsettling in the best way. The conceit, an infant with a sophisticated British accent who was plotting his mother's murder and working on a weather control device, was committed to with a kind of straight-faced earnestness that made it funnier. The show treated Stewie's villainy as real. He had monologues, he had devices, he had plans. There was a specific brand of comedy that came from this tiny child, speaking with complete patrician authority about his scheme to eliminate the woman, while everyone around him either didn't understand or didn't notice. There's a kind of comedy that comes from radical incongruity done absolutely straight, the gap between what something is and how it's presenting itself. Early Stewie worked because the show never winked at the audience. There was no "look how absurd this is" energy. The show just presented an evil genius baby as a fact of life and moved on. That commitment to the bit is what makes absurdist comedy land. An early Family Guy had it. Peter's obliviousness, Stewie's villainy, Brian's world weariness, these were consistent and committed to, and the commitment was the source of the humour. Brian was genuinely dry and funny in a way that felt earned. He read Tolstoy, he drank martinis, he had a weary relationship with the family that was defined by being the smartest person in the room who had nonetheless chosen to remain in that room, which is its own kind of joke with its own kind of pathos. The show ran into trouble almost immediately. Fox moved it around the schedule repeatedly. It got slotted opposite Frasier on Thursday nights, which was not a fight it was going to win. Ratings dropped. Fox started airing episodes irregularly. By the end of the second season, the show was already in trouble. It limped through a third season and was cancelled in 2002. At the time, the cancellation was not treated as a major event. The show had been struggling. It didn't feel like a tragedy. There wasn't a huge cultural mobilisation to save it the way there was with, say, Firefly, which was cancelled around the same time and developed a passionate cult following almost immediately. What's worth noting in retrospect is that the show that was cancelled in 2002 still had some of these earlier qualities intact. The characters still had some of their original definition. The family dynamic still had some texture. The cutaway structure was present but not yet fully dominant. Whatever Family Guy was going to become, it wasn't quite that yet in 2002. The show that came back in 2005 was something different, shaped partly by what had happened in the intervening years and partly by the specific conditions of its own resurrection. But something happened in the years after cancellation that would change the show's trajectory entirely. And the change it would produce was not, arguably, the change anyone should have wanted. Adult Swim started airing Family Guy reruns in 2003. This was not a grand plan. It was cable television filling hours with existing content, but it turned out that Family Guy, running late at night on a network that had built its brand around exactly this kind of adult animation, found an audience that the original Fox broadcast schedule had never located. There's something interesting about the Adult Swim audience of that era that's worth mentioning. Adult Swim late-night programming had a specific cultural character. It was college students staying up too late, people who found network television too safe, Viewers who had grown up with the original run of Beavis and Butthead and were looking for something in that register. Family Guy, which had been conceived partly as a wilder alternative to The Simpsons, fit that audience's sensibility in a way that Fox's Sunday evening slot never quite accommodated. There's also something about the 1 a.m. viewing context itself that shaped how Family Guy's structure worked. When you're watching television late at night, alone or with one or two friends, your relationship to narrative coherence changes. You're not watching to follow a story with full concentration. You're watching to be entertained in a low-key, intermittent way. Your attention drifts, you talk over parts of it, you look at your phone, you come back. The cutaway gag structure was, accidentally or by design, perfectly suited to this kind of fractured attention. Each gag was self-contained enough that you could zone out between cutaways and zone back in and immediately understand what was happening. You didn't need to track a plot because there wasn't much of one to track. This is not a criticism. It's an observation about fit. Family Guy found an audience whose viewing habits matched its structure, and the match amplified both the show's success and the writing room's incentives to keep doing what was working. When something works for a specific audience in a specific context, the natural response is to give them more of it. The show was giving the 1 a.m. Adult Swim crowd exactly what they wanted, and they responded by buying the DVDs and watching the reruns and petitioning Fox to bring the show back, which Fox did, which reinforced the whole cycle. The DVD sales followed. The first volume of Family Guy episodes sold extraordinarily well, then the second volume. The numbers started coming in, and they looked nothing like the ratings figures that had gotten the show cancelled, which is a strange thing to sit with. The show that Fox couldn't make work in prime time was apparently beloved enough that people were paying to own it. It turned out that people liked Family Guy. They just hadn't been watching it on Sunday nights at 8:30 in a competitive time slot. They were watching it at 1 a.m. on Adult Swim. They were buying the box sets and watching episodes with their friends on a Friday night. They were consuming it as a thing you put on rather than a thing you scheduled around. Fox paid attention. By 2005, Family Guy was back. Season 4 premiered on May 1st, 2005, and the ratings were strong. The show had survived its own death. This is a remarkable thing in television history. Shows get cancelled all the time. They don't usually come back. And when they do come back, they usually come back to diminished expectations and smaller budgets. Family Guy came back to a reception that was almost triumphant. The whole narrative around it was one of a show that had been wrongly cancelled, rescued by its audience, vindicated by the market. Seth MacFarlane had leverage he hadn't had before. The show had cultural momentum, and then it started to change. The change wasn't immediate or obvious. Season 4 still had episodes that felt relatively connected to the show's original sensibility, but the cutaway gags increased in frequency and looseness. The plots got thinner. The characters started to feel like they were being driven more by what joke was needed in a given moment than by who they were as people. The reset button got pressed more aggressively between episodes. Things happened in one episode that had no consequence in the next. There's a theory about why this happened, and it's one of the more interesting bits of television industry analysis I've encountered. The argument goes like this: the show didn't learn the right lesson from its own resurrection. What had survived the cancellation wasn't the story. It wasn't the character work. What had circulated, what people had clipped from VHS recordings and shared online, what had played best on Adult Swim at 1 a.m, what had made the DVDs worth buying, was the gags, the cutaways, the standalone moments, Peter hurting himself and then doing that weird prolonged wheezing sound, Stewie delivering a monologue about something absurd, a random celebrity being humiliated. These were the things that people rewound. These were the things that people texted their friends about. There's also a writer room dynamic worth considering here. After the cancellation, a number of the show's original writers moved on to other projects. When Family Guy was revived, it needed to rebuild its writing team, and the writers it brought in were largely people who'd been drawn to the show for its gag humour, the thing that had made it famous in reruns and DVD, rather than for the slightly more character-grounded approach of the early seasons. The room was stocked, in other words, by people who were trying to reproduce what they loved about the show. And what they loved about the show was primarily the cutaway structure, which made the post-revival period an almost self-fulfilling prophecy. The writers who were hired because they loved the gags made a show with more gags, which attracted fans who loved the gags, which reinforced the decision to hire gag-first writers. This kind of selection pressure is hard to see when you're inside it and fairly obvious from the outside. The show was being pulled in the direction of its most immediately popular elements by people who had good professional reasons to pull it in that direction, and there wasn't really a structural force available to push back. MacFarlane was running multiple shows by this point. American Dad had launched in 2005. His attention was divided, and Family Guy kept getting renewed because it kept getting watched, which meant there was no commercial incentive to revisit the structural decisions that were beginning to define it. So the show gave audiences more of what they seemed to want, which makes a kind of commercial sense. But here's the problem. The gags had worked in context against a background of characters who felt somewhat real in a show that had some structural coherence. Strip away that background and give people only the gags, and you've removed the thing that made the gags feel like they came from somewhere. You've confirmed that they don't come from anywhere. You've made Parker and Stone's argument for them. Season 7 has an episode with a recurring gag where the show cuts away to Conway Twitty performing one of his country songs. Not a quick cut, a full performance. Multiple times. The first one is perhaps 30 seconds. The second one is longer. The third one runs for nearly 3 minutes of uninterrupted Conway Twitty before cutting back to the story. The show is, in this moment, making a joke out of its own cutaway structure, acknowledging that the interruptions have gotten so long and so untethered from anything that you might as well just watch 3 minutes of Conway Twitty. It's almost self-aware. Almost. The Conway Twitty gag became one of the more discussed moments from that era of the show, not because it was the worst thing Family Guy had done, but because it was the most transparent about what was happening. The story had become genuinely secondary. The episodes were delivery mechanisms for disconnected moments. The structure had been revealed, and the show's response was to make a joke about the structure rather than to reconsider it, which I suppose is very on-brand. What the resurrection period created in the end was a show with a clearly articulated identity built around maximal joke density and minimal structural commitment, a large and loyal audience for exactly that, and no particular incentive to change. Whether that counts as success depends on what you think television should be doing. The manatee joke in Cartoon Wars is very funny, but it's also doing some serious analytical work, and it's worth unpacking what exactly it's arguing, because the argument is more precise than it might seem on first viewing. Parker and Stone's complaint about Family Guy was not simply the jokes are random. Randomness can be a legitimate comedic strategy. The surrealist tradition in comedy, Monty Python, Airplane, early Mel Brooks, leans heavily on non sequiturs and deliberately illogical construction. Nobody watching the Black Knight scene in Monty Python and the Holy Grail is demanding that the severed limbs make narrative sense. The absurdity is the point, and it's worth noting that South Park is itself frequently absurd. Randy Marsh turning into a giant muscular creature, Cartman gaining telekinesis, Kenny dying in increasingly creative ways. The show doesn't reject absurdism, it embraces it enthusiastically. What it rejects is disconnected absurdism. The absurd things that happen in South Park happen to specific people in specific situations, and the comedy emerges from the collision between the absurdity and the specific reality it's disrupting. Randy's absurd behaviour is funny because it's in conflict with the specific suburban Colorado context he inhabits. The absurdity means something because it's grounded. Family Guy's absurdism, by contrast, tends to float free of any grounding. The cutaway takes you outside the show's world entirely and shows you something that isn't happening to anyone in the episode. It's not even absurdism, really. It's more like a comedy sketch that happens to be embedded in the episode. Funny in isolation, unmoored from anything. The specific complaint was about the structural relationship between the jokes and the story. In Family Guy, cutaway gags exist in what comedy theorists sometimes call hammer space, a term borrowed from cartoons, referring to the impossible off-screen space where characters store objects that are too large to fit on their person. Bugs Bunny reaches into hammer space to pull out a mallet. The mallet exists outside the rules of the cartoon's physical world. It can appear and disappear without consequence. Family Guy, Parker and Stone were arguing, treats time itself the way Bugs Bunny treats hammer space. The cutaway borrows a few seconds from the episode's timeline, shows you something completely unrelated to what's happening, and then returns those seconds unused. The cutaway didn't happen in the story's world. It can't be referred to later. It can't change anything. It's sealed off from cause and effect. And here's the thing about jokes that are sealed off from cause and effect. They can be funny, but they can't be about anything. A joke that lives inside a story can advance the story, or complicate it, or reveal something about a character, or set up a consequence. A joke that lives outside the story can only be funny in isolation. It cannot accumulate meaning. It cannot build toward anything. It lands and then it evaporates. Cartman's line in the episode puts this more bluntly. If you look closely at the writing in Family Guy, you will see that the jokes never derive from the plot. And a Family Guy staffer in the episode responds, "And what's wrong with that?" Which is the genuine counter-argument. There's nothing inherently wrong with jokes that don't derive from the plot, if you accept that plot is just a delivery mechanism for jokers, which is a defensible position. But Parker and Stone's deeper point, the one the manatee visual is making, is about authorship and intention. When you watch a South Park episode, there's a sensibility behind it. There's a point of view. The jokes couldn't have been made by anyone other than the people who made them, about anyone other than the characters who populate the show. The comedy is specific. The specificity is what makes it funny and what makes it mean something. When you watch a Family Guy cutaway, you're watching something that could, the manatees argue, have been generated by selecting random balls from a pile. Not because the jokes are poorly executed, but because there's no necessary connection between these jokes and this episode. The balls could have been arranged differently, and you'd have a different episode that would be equally valid, equally funny, and equally meaningless as a piece of storytelling. There's a useful way to think about this distinction that has nothing to do with television. Consider two kinds of gifts. The first kind is the gift someone picks specifically for you, because they know you, because they've been paying attention, because they thought about what would mean something to you in particular. The second kind is a gift from a list of universally acceptable presents. A bottle of wine, a candle, something generic and pleasant. The second gift might be perfectly nice. You might even prefer the wine to the specific gift. But the two gestures are not the same. One of them required knowing you. One of them required attention and care and particularity. The other required only knowing that gift-giving was required. Character-based comedy is the first kind of gift. It comes from attention to specific people. The joke only works because you've been paying attention to who this character is. The cutaway gag is the second kind, perfectly pleasant, sometimes excellent, and requiring no particular knowledge of the recipient. That distinction is what Parker and Stone were making, and it's a distinction that holds regardless of whether you prefer the wine. The Aristotle framing is useful here, even if it sounds more academic than I'd like to make this. Aristotle wrote about unity of action. The idea that the events of a story should be causally connected, so that if you removed any one element, the whole thing would be different. A cutaway gag fails the unity test by design. Remove it and nothing changes. Add a different one and nothing changes. The episode is the same episode regardless of which balls the manatees select. What this means in practice, over the course of a season and then a decade of seasons, is that Family Guy produces episodes that don't build on each other in any meaningful way. You can watch season 12 without having watched season 3, and you won't have missed anything, because nothing persists, no consequence accumulates, no character grows. There's a useful phrase from literary criticism here: killing your darlings. The idea is that a writer should be willing to cut a beautiful sentence or a funny scene if it doesn't serve the larger piece. The reason you cut it is precisely because you care about the whole more than you care about the individual part. What the cutaway gag structure does, essentially, is invert this. It declares that the individual part is what matters, and the larger piece exists only to house the parts. The darlings are never killed. The whole exists to protect them, and I think this is where the long-term cost shows up most clearly. After a decade of cutaway first production, the episodes stop being episodes in any meaningful narrative sense. They're playlists, collections. The difference between watching a Family Guy episode and watching a YouTube compilation of Family Guy clips becomes progressively smaller, until eventually there's essentially no difference at all. The show consumes itself into the clip format that made it popular. That's the argument. Whether you think it matters depends on what you want from comedy, but it's a cleaner, more specific argument than Family Guy is bad and it's worth taking seriously. One more thing about Parker and Stone's position that gets lost in how the story tends to be told. They acknowledged that Family Guy's writers were smart. They were not saying the people making Family Guy were incapable or lazy in any personal sense. They were saying that a group of smart, capable writers had made a specific structural choice to prioritize gag density over narrative coherence, and that this choice had real artistic consequences. The frustration wasn't with the writers as people, it was with the choice as a choice. That's a more nuanced position than it's usually given credit for, and it's one that Seth MacFarlane himself seemed to recognize when he said the manatee critique was accurate alongside funny. He understood what was being said. He just had a different view of whether it mattered. There's a concept in television criticism called Flanderization. It comes from The Simpsons, from Ned Flanders specifically, who started the show as a friendly, slightly irritating religious neighbour and gradually became a single-note caricature of Christian conservatism with no other traits. The term refers to what happens when a character's defining quality gets amplified over many seasons until it consumes everything else about them. The person becomes the trait. The trait becomes the whole character. Peter Griffin is one of the more dramatic examples of Flanderization in animated television. Season 1. Peter is dim. He makes bad decisions. He says things that are wrong and says them with confidence. He's a classic sitcom bumbler, but he also clearly loves his family. He worries about things. He has friends he's loyal to. There's an episode in the first season where he thinks he's dying, and his attempt to make things right with his family before he goes, clumsy, misguided, but genuinely motivated by love, is actually touching in the way that early episodes of that kind of show can be touching when they're trying. Season 10. Peter is functionally a different person. The progression happened gradually and then all at once. The stupidity that was endearing in Season 1 became something stranger and more troubling over time. By the middle seasons, Peter's obliviousness had crossed into active cruelty in ways that the show treated as funny, rather than as things requiring acknowledgement or consequence. He would do things to his family, to Meg especially, but also to Lois, to Chris, to his own well-being, that in a realistic context would indicate serious pathology. The Flanderization term is useful, but also slightly imprecise when applied to Peter, because Ned Flanders' problem was that one existing trait, his religiousness, expanded to fill his entire character. Peter's problem is a bit different. His traits didn't so much expand as they shifted in valence. The obliviousness that originally read as innocent and warm shifted into something that read as self-involved and cruel. Same basic behaviour, different emotional register. The writing's framing of Peter's stupidity changed from this lovable oaf to this man who genuinely doesn't care if his actions hurt people, and the show never quite acknowledged the transition. It's the kind of drift that happens when a character is used primarily as a vehicle for gags rather than as a person with consistent psychology. When the character serves the joke rather than the joke serving the character will go wherever the joke needs them to go. If the joke needs Peter to be clueless, he's clueless. If the joke needs Peter to be cruel, he's cruel. The fact that cruelty is a different thing from cluelessness, that they imply different things about who a person is, stops mattering when the character's psychology is just scaffolding for the next bit. And the show kept resetting. Every episode, the damage was repaired. Every episode, the baseline was restored. Peter didn't learn anything because the structure didn't require him to learn anything. The reset button meant that whatever happened this week had no effect on next week, which meant that Peter could behave in increasingly extreme ways without ever facing a reckoning. The chicken fights are a useful case study. In Season 2, Peter gets into a brawl with a giant chicken named Ernie after a coupon dispute. It's a brief, silly scene, Peter and this enormous bird punching each other in the middle of the street. A quick gag. It ends. Then in Season 4, the chicken comes back. The fight is longer this time, more elaborate, with proper choreography and escalating mayhem. It takes over the episode for a few minutes. People found it funny. Then it became a recurring thing. Then a franchise. By later seasons, the chicken fights are enormous, extended set pieces that last 4 or 5 minutes, demolishing entire city blocks, featuring complex stunt work and existing entirely for their own sake, as kinetic spectacle with no connection to character or story, which is exactly what the manatee argument is about. The chicken fight is funny in isolation. It's technically impressive. It has nothing to do with Peter Griffin as a character. You could drop it into any episode or remove it from any episode, and the episode would be equally coherent. It's a show within the show that happens to feature the show's main character. The trajectory from brief funny gag to elaborate spectacle that exists for its own sake is the trajectory of the show in miniature. What starts as a joke about something becomes, over many iterations, something that exists independently of the joke that generated it. The chicken fight stopped being a joke about Peter's tendency to escalate minor disputes into absurd confrontations. It became a production challenge, an animation showcase, a piece of recurring spectacle that fans knew to expect. That drift from meaning to spectacle is, again, the manatee argument playing out in real time. The relationship with Lois tracked the same trajectory. Early seasons had genuine friction between them, the kind of friction a marriage actually has, where two people with different backgrounds and different needs are trying to figure out how to share a life. Lois had given up something to be with Peter. Peter occasionally understood this and was grateful. The dynamic had texture. What that texture got replaced with, over seasons, was a simpler arrangement. Peter does terrible things, Lois disapproves, things resolve without consequence, everyone is back to baseline next week. It's not a marriage anymore. It's a mechanism for generating plots. The reset button problem is particularly visible in Peter and Lois's relationship because marriages in real life accumulate. Every argument leaves a small residue. Every moment of genuine connection adds a layer. The history of a marriage is the marriage. Family Guy's decision to press reset after every episode meant that Peter and Lois's marriage could never accumulate anything. It had to start from the same place every week, which meant it could never actually be about anything beyond what was happening in that specific episode. It was, in the end, a marriage-shaped placeholder rather than a marriage. For comparison, Stan and Francine in American Dad are in a marriage that accumulates. Episodes refer to previous episodes. Their conflicts build on established patterns. When they fight about something in season 10, you can trace the roots of that fight back through their shared history. When they reconcile, the reconciliation means something because the conflict meant something. This is what it looks like when a show decides that its characters are real enough to have a history. Family Guy decided, implicitly, that histories were inconvenient. The Peter problem got the most attention because Peter is the show's centre and his drift was therefore most visible. But the same process played out in different registers across the entire Griffin family. Lois herself was more interesting then. There's a backstory there that the show seeded in early episodes and then largely abandoned. Her wealthy parents, her sense of having chosen a different path from what she was raised to want, her musical ability, a past that felt a bit more complicated than patient housewife. The show gestured toward a Lois who had layers. It didn't always follow through, but the gestures were there. There are episodes in the early seasons where Lois gets to be the interesting one, where the comedy comes from her history and her complications rather than from Peter's chaos. An early episode deals with her past as a wild, impulsive person who'd had quite the life before marriage, and the joke is partly about how much of that person is still in there beneath the housewife's surface. That's a rich premise. There's genuine, comedic and emotional territory in the question of what you become when you settle down, and whether you made the right call, and who you were before the settling. Later seasons mostly forgot that premise existed. Lois became reliably patient, reliably exasperated, reliably tolerant of things she shouldn't tolerate. The complexity got sanded off in the same way it got sanded off Peter, but less noticeably because Lois started from a less extreme position. Where Peter's drift was from bumbling but lovable to something stranger and crueler, Lois's drift was from complex and interesting to functional and forgettable. She still appeared in every episode. She still had lines. But the thing that made her specifically Lois, as opposed to generic sitcom wife, quietly evaporated. Over time, Lois's personality became subject to what the episode needed in a given week. Sometimes she'd be the voice of reason. Sometimes she'd be a participant in the dysfunction. Sometimes she'd exhibit a wildness that the episode used as a story engine and then forgot. The lack of consistency wasn't really about Lois being complex. A character can be complex and still be consistent. It was about the show not having committed to who she was in a way that constrained what she could do week to week. When you don't commit to a character's core, you can use them for anything. The downside is they stop being a person and become a costume the plot puts on. Brian went through a different kind of drift. The show, to its credit, eventually acknowledged what had happened to Brian. But the acknowledgement was delivered through a character who was himself problematic, which meant the self-awareness didn't actually fix anything. In season 1, Stewie is an evil genius baby. Full stop. He wants to kill his mother. He's building a device to take over the world. He speaks in received pronunciation. He refers to Lois as the woman with a specific contempt that implies a very long and complicated grievance. He has plans, he has setbacks, he monologues. He is, in those early episodes, one of the more original characters in animated television. Not because Evil Babies are novel, but because the show committed to the bit with a deadpan thoroughness that made it land. By around season 5 or 6, the world domination plots had quietly faded. By later seasons, they were essentially gone. Stewie became something closer to Brian's sidekick, a somewhat effete, occasionally flamboyant, reliably sarcastic companion for the dog's various misadventures. The evil genius infrastructure disappeared. Nobody explained why, it just stopped. The show's explanation, to the extent it had one, seemed to be that the evil genius premise had run its natural course, and the character had evolved. But evolution in a show that doesn't maintain continuity is a strange thing. Stewie didn't evolve so much as he was replaced. The Season 1. Stewie and the Season 12 Stewie are not the same character with a shared history. They're different characters who happen to share a name, a voice, and a design. The show behaved as though viewers would simply accept the new version without noticing the discontinuity. And in large part they did. The later Stewie had his own appeal, but the original premise was genuinely funnier and more specific. What was lost when Stewie's villainy disappeared was the show's most distinctive premise. You can find a sarcastic baby in a lot of places. A received pronunciation-speaking infant plotting global domination while his family fails to notice was something quite particular. The strangeness of that specific combination was what made Stewie work. Strip the villainy and you have a well-voiced character with a few funny traits. Which is fine, but it's a smaller thing than what was there before. And the family's relationship to Stewie's speech changed too, in a way the show never resolved. In early episodes, the adults could not understand Stewie. His monologues were for the audience. By later seasons, this rule was applied inconsistently. Sometimes characters respond to what Stewie says, sometimes they don't, and the show made no effort to establish a logic for when each would apply. What this inconsistency reveals, more than anything else, is how little the show trusted its own rules. The original conceit that Stewie's inner life was invisible to his family, that his villainy was a private joke between the show and the viewer, was genuinely clever. It created two simultaneous realities in the same scene, the family's mundane version and Stewie's secret one. Abandoning that without explanation didn't just lose the original joke, it collapsed the specific layer of irony that made Stewie work. By the time the show occasionally let characters hear him, and occasionally didn't, the conceit had just become noise. Brian went through a different kind of drift. The show, to its credit, eventually acknowledged what had happened to Brian, but the acknowledgement was delivered through a character who was himself problematic, which meant the self-awareness didn't actually fix anything. The moment is in Season 9. Quagmire, who up to that point had been defined almost entirely as a cheerfully predatory womanizer, gives Brian a speech. He tells Brian exactly why he dislikes him. That Brian is a shallow, self-absorbed hypocrite who talks about being a writer but doesn't write, who talks about caring about people but consistently treats them badly, who dresses his selfishness in the language of intellectual concern. It's a genuinely sharp piece of writing. It diagnoses something real about where the character had ended up, and then nothing changed. Brian continued being more or less exactly what Quagmire described. The show had looked in the mirror and then put the mirror away. This is, in a strange way, a more sophisticated kind of failure than simple neglect. Simple neglect is when a character just stops getting stories. What happened with Brian is that the show developed a critical awareness of its own character, and then chose to do nothing with that awareness. Quagmire's speech is well observed and specific. It names real things about Brian that the audience has been noticing for years. The fact that nothing follows from it is almost more frustrating than if the speech had never been written. It's like the writers filed a detailed report on the problem and then archived it. There's a pattern here across multiple characters that's worth naming. Family Guy developed a habit of meta-commentary that substituted for actual change. The show would acknowledge, through a joke or a line of dialogue, that something had gone wrong with a character or a dynamic, and the acknowledgement would function as a kind of absolution, as if noticing the problem out loud was the same as addressing it. The Conway Twitty gag did this with the cutaway structure. The Quagmire speech did it with Brian. The Seahorse Seashell Party episode did it with Meg. In each case, the show proved it understood the critique and then continued doing what it had been doing. Chris stopped being a character around Season 5, and I'm not sure the show ever quite noticed. His early characterization had a few interesting corners. He had a talent for drawing, a slightly surreal relationship with a demon that lived in his closet, a sensitivity that sat oddly against his general dopiness. These threads got dropped. He became a presence rather than a person. In some ways, Chris's quiet disappearance from meaningful storylines is actually the most telling data point in this whole analysis. The show didn't have to damage Chris the way it damaged Meg, or drift the way Stewie drifted, or calcify the way Peter calcified. It simply stopped being interested in him. When you have a structural commitment to a format, where the gags drive everything and the characters are just the delivery mechanism, some characters will inevitably become redundant. The ones whose personalities generate the most immediate jokes will get the screen time. The others will fade. Chris faded. The manatees didn't select his ball as often. Meg deserves her own section. What happened to Meg Griffin is its own specific story, and it's one that the show eventually addressed so directly and with such clarity that the address itself became evidence of the problem. Early Meg had a function in the show that was recognisable and, in its modest way, effective. She was the insecure teenager trying to fit in. She wanted to be liked and wasn't. She had crushes that went unrequited. She was slightly invisible to her family in the way teenagers sometimes feel invisible to their families. This was not groundbreaking material, but it was material. There was something to work with there, the particular, specific loneliness of adolescence, of wanting to be seen and constantly getting the sense that you're not. And there were moments in those early seasons where the show actually did something with this. Episodes where Meg's awkwardness was played with genuine sympathy alongside the comedy, where her desire to be accepted felt real enough that you winced a bit when things went wrong for her. That's a functional emotional register for a character in a comedy, not tragedy, but pathos. The show was using Meg's position to say something small but true about what it's like to be a teenager who doesn't fit the social template. The transition from that to what Meg became is hard to pin to a single moment. It wasn't a decision that got made in a writer's room meeting. It accumulated. Each season, the jokes at Meg's expense got a little cruder, the family's contempt for her got a little more explicit, and the show's framing of that contempt as funny got a little more comfortable. Until at some point, you're watching an episode where the entire premise is the family forgetting Meg exists, and it's not being framed as dark or sad or ironic. It's being played straight as comedy. And the question of who is laughing and at what starts to get complicated. Over time, the show's treatment of Meg hardened into something stranger and less comfortable. The invisibility became active contempt. The family didn't just overlook Meg, they expressed a specific hostility toward her existence. Peter told her directly he didn't care about her. Episodes were structured around everyone forgetting Meg existed, as though this were funny, rather than as though it had any weight. The abuse became relentless, in the specific way that the frog in boiling water analogy is meant to describe, incremental enough that you didn't necessarily notice exactly when it stopped being sharp observational comedy about family dysfunction and started being something that just kept going. Then season 10 produced an episode called Seahorse Seashell Party. And in this episode, Meg finally said something back. She confronted the family. She told them exactly how they treated her and exactly what it had cost her. The speech is actually well written, it's specific and emotionally coherent, and it lands with real weight, partly because the show had spent so many seasons establishing the dynamic that the confrontation finally felt earned. The episode aired in 2011, which puts it roughly in the middle of the show's run. By that point, the Griffin family's mistreatment of Meg had become one of the show's most recognisable recurring elements. Viewers had watched it for almost a decade, and there was a subset of the audience, probably larger than the show's writers expected, who had been quietly hoping for exactly this moment, who wanted Meg to say something, who had been watching her absorb years of contempt and waiting for the point at which the show would acknowledge what it had been doing. Seahorse Seashell Party offered that moment, and then it took it away, and then Meg took it all back. The episode's explanation, delivered by Meg herself, which is the part that makes it so strange, is that she is a lightning rod for the family's dysfunction. If she absorbs the abuse, the family's cruelties don't have to go somewhere else. She is, in some sense, sacrificing herself to maintain the family's equilibrium, and so she chooses to accept this role. She recants the confrontation. She tells her family what they want to hear. The dynamic resets. The audience who had been waiting for Meg to get her moment received the episode, watched the confrontation, and then watched it be undone. The show gave them something and then immediately retrieved it, which is, in retrospect, perhaps the most honest possible expression of what Family Guy had decided about Meg. That her dignity was available as a story device, but not as a permanent feature of who she was. The writers could borrow it for an episode and then put it back in the box. This is a fascinating piece of writing that is also a confession. The writers understood what they were doing with Meg. They constructed a meta-narrative justification for why the dynamic could never change. Because if it changed, the show would have to become something different. Meg's suffering is structural. It can't be resolved. The episode made this explicit and then used the explicitness as permission to continue. The contrast with Steve Smith in American Dad, a character who occupies a similar archetype, the awkward, unpopular teenager in a family with a domineering father, is genuinely instructive. Steve gets to win sometimes. He gets to discover things about himself and develop skills and have victories, even small ones, that accumulate. He grows. His relationship with Stan changes over many seasons in ways that feel earned. When American Dad puts Steve in a humiliating situation, the humiliation usually serves the story and has a resolution that acknowledges his dignity. His suffering isn't structural. There's a version of Meg's story that could have been told. The show clearly had the writers capable of telling it. Seahorse Seashell Party shows that. The choice not to tell that story, to have the lightning rod explanation serve as a permanent permission slip, tells you something about what the show had decided to value. It also tells you something about the difference between self-awareness and self-correction. These are not the same thing, and Family Guy repeatedly demonstrated the gap between them. Being aware of a problem and being willing to fix it require different kinds of commitment. The show had the former in abundance, the latter was always in shorter supply. And here's the thing about Meg's treatment that makes it more than just a character-level issue. It affected what the show was willing to be emotionally. A show that designates one of its characters as a permanent victim, not a tragic figure with agency, not a character whose suffering drives meaningful story, but a structural punching bag, is a show that has decided mean-spiritedness is acceptable as a baseline. That decision radiates outward. It creates a tone. The audience learns, over time, that the show doesn't necessarily care about the people it's depicting. And when a show stops caring about its characters, it becomes harder for the audience to care about them either. The long-term consequence is a kind of emotional disengagement. You stop rooting for these people because the show has told you, through the treatment of Meg, that the people in it are not quite real in the ways that would make rooting for them feel meaningful. They're joke delivery mechanisms, some more sympathetic than others, but underneath everything, there's a structure that sacrifices actual people, even fictional ones, for the laugh. That's not a small thing. That's the whole ball game, really, in terms of what separates comedy that stays with you from comedy that evaporates. Here's a detail I find genuinely delightful about the Cartoon Wars aftermath. After Part 1 aired in April 2006, Parker and Stone started getting calls from other animation shows. The Simpsons writing staff sent flowers to the South Park offices. Not a note, flowers. The King of the Hill team called and told them they were doing God's work. Parker talked about this in the DVD commentary and in subsequent interviews. He described it as an animation solidarity moment where everyone did come together over their hatred of Family Guy. And he added that, in his opinion, the Simpsons writers hate Family Guy more than we do, even though they won't say it publicly. Which is interesting for several reasons. The Simpsons comparison had always been the uncomfortable one for Family Guy. When the show launched in 1999, it was immediately positioned by critics and audiences as a successor to The Simpsons, or at least a spiritual contemporary. Both were adult animated sitcoms on Fox about dysfunction families in fictional American towns. Both had ensemble casts. Both used comedy to look at something true about American life. The Simpsons writers, presumably, did not enjoy this comparison, and presumably for reasons that go beyond simple territorial instinct. The Simpsons in its classic period, roughly seasons 3 through 8, the years that produced most of what people mean when they say classic Simpsons, was built on exactly the kind of character-rooted comedy that Parker and Stone were defending. Jokes came from who Homer was, from the specific dynamics of the Simpson family, from the particular texture of Springfield as a world. Being told that Family Guy was doing something equivalent felt apparently like being told something was equivalent that was not. There's also a generational dimension here. The Simpsons writers of the mid-2000s were largely people who had grown up on the show, had joined the staff partly because they loved what it had been in its peak years, and were now watching a newer, noisier show get credited with inventing something that their show had done first and better. Family Guy's cutaway structure was sometimes described by critics as the new Simpsons. For people who'd worked on the actual Simpsons, that comparison probably felt about as flattering as being told a photocopier was the new Rembrandt. The King of the Hill comparison is equally interesting. King of the Hill was Mike Judge's show about a propane dealer in a small Texas town, a show that was in many ways the opposite of Family Guy in terms of approach. Understated where Family Guy was loud, patient where Family Guy was frenetic, character-driven in a way that was almost stubbornly committed. Jokes on King of the Hill came out of who Hank Hill was, who Dale was, who Boomhauer was, what it meant to live in that particular community with those particular values. The idea that Family Guy and King of the Hill were occupying the same space in animated television was, from Judge's perspective, probably rather like being told a Swiss watch and a rubber band clock were doing the same thing. Both The Simpsons and King of the Hill received acknowledgements in Cartoon Wars Part 2. The character who appears to be Bart Simpson shows up briefly, exchanges a few words with Cartman, and gets dismissed. It's a warm gesture from Parker and Stone toward a show they respected and wanted to acknowledge in the context of the broader argument they were making. Seth MacFarlane, for his part, was aware of the industry temperature. His public comments after Cartoon Wars were careful. He separated his reaction to the episode itself, which he found funny, from his feelings about some of the more pointed press comments Parker and Stone had made off-camera, which he found less charming. More on that in the next section. What the animation solidarity moment reveals, beyond the specific grievance about Family Guy, is something about how creative communities talk, or don't talk, about quality within their own industry. Television is a competitive business. Competitive. Shows don't typically call out their rivals publicly, because the industry is small and people work together, and it's generally considered poor form. The fact that The Simpsons writers sent flowers, privately, not in a press statement, and that King of the Hill called to offer encouragement tells you that the feelings were real, but operating at a certain level of discretion. Parker and Stone were willing to go on the record in a way that the other shows weren't. They had the leverage to do it. South Park was a cultural phenomenon by 2006, and the personality to do it. They enjoyed the provocation. Trey Parker has said in interviews that part of the joy of South Park is that they can say things that other people in the industry feel but won't say. The Cartoon Wars episodes were doing exactly that, in the specific case of Family Guy's writing methodology. The Simpsons sending flowers is also interesting because by 2006, The Simpsons was itself in a period of creative difficulty. The classic seasons were behind it. The show was still running. It's still running now, decades later. But the argument that it had maintained the quality of its peak years was hard to make with a straight face. In a way, The Simpsons writers reaching out to South Park to thank them for defending character-based comedy was also a gesture of solidarity with their own past selves. A recognition that the thing they'd built in the early 90s was genuinely different from what Family Guy was doing, and that the distinction deserved to be stated. There's something quietly poignant about that, actually. An old show's writers thanking a newer show for defending the principles the old show had been built on. No notes. Since we're on the topic of industry reactions, The Simpsons and Family Guy eventually did a crossover episode in 2014 called The Simpsons Guy. It's a long, somewhat strange piece of television that gets discussed more for the novelty of the premise than for its quality. The tone of the episode is fascinating in the context of all this. The Simpsons characters are largely bemused and slightly condescending about the Griffins, and there's a running joke about how the two shows are basically the same, which both shows know is not quite right, but neither commits to arguing against. It's the most polite possible acknowledgement of a long-standing awkwardness. The flowers are not mentioned. What the crossover episode reveals, inadvertently, is exactly the gap that Parker and Stone were trying to describe. When you put the two families in the same room, the difference in how each show's characters are constructed becomes visible. The Springfield characters have specific, accumulated histories. Homer and Bart have a father-son dynamic built up over more than 2 decades of storytelling. Their interactions have weight because the show has established exactly who they are and what they mean to each other. When Homer says something to Bart in The Simpsons Guy, it carries the whole history of their relationship. The Griffins, in the same episode, feel more like premises than people. Peter is defined by his stupidity, Stewie by his sarcasm, Brian by his pretension. These are notes, not characters. They play the notes correctly, and the gags land, but there's no accumulated history behind them to give the interactions weight. The episode can make jokes about both families, but the jokes don't feel equivalent. One set of jokes is landing on people with depth, the other is landing on outlines. It's not that The Simpsons crossover episode is particularly good. It isn't really, but it is instructive. Putting the two shows in direct contact exposed the structural difference in a way that watching them separately doesn't quite capture. The gap was visible in a new way when you could see both sides of it simultaneously. Seth MacFarlane's reaction to Cartoon Wars is worth spending some time on because it's more layered than the simple, gracious acceptance version that tends to get repeated. The most famous moment was his Harvard commencement address in June 2006. He was invited to give the class day address, a tradition separate from the main graduation ceremony, where a speaker is chosen by the students themselves. He delivered much of the speech in character as Stewie, and in that speech he addressed the South Park criticism directly, in character, which is a very particular way to acknowledge a piece of satire. From inside your own satire, wearing the voice of the character, the other show had spent 2 episodes analysing. There's something almost elegant about that move. Rather than responding to a comedy critique with a defensive press statement, which would have looked bad and felt wrong, MacFarlane absorbed the critique into his own comedic frame and addressed it there. It's a graceful response, and it says something about his sophistication as a performer and a public figure that he chose it. He understood the register in which the critique had been delivered, and he responded in kind. The Harvard address also had the effect of making MacFarlane look generous. He was willing to acknowledge the attack, to find the humour in it, to bring it up in a public setting and handle it with lightness. That graciousness was genuinely attractive. It was also probably the correct strategic choice. If you're too wounded by satire to engage with it, you confirm that the satire landed. MacFarlane's willingness to stand in the blast radius and say, "Yeah, fair enough," was more effective than any rebuttal would have been. Later, in a 2012 interview with Rolling Stone, he gave his fullest response. He said he found the Cartoon Wars episodes funny and accurate. That's a significant thing to say. He wasn't defending the show's writing choices or arguing that the manatee critique was wrong. He was saying, "Yes, I see what you were pointing at. It was funny. It was accurate. Where his frustration showed was in a different direction. He said, "What I don't understand is the personal venom that they spew in the press about the show and about me, where it's not in the context of a joke." He was distinguishing between the satirical critique, which he could engage with and even appreciate, and the out-of-character press statements where Parker and Stone described Family Guy's writers as lazy or talked about the specific contempt they felt for the show. Those felt different to him. Less like comedy colleagues making a craft argument, and more like a personal attack dressed in professional language. It's a fair distinction. Parker and Stone made remarks in interviews, outside of the show, not through any satirical frame, that were pointed in a way that went beyond what Cartoon Wars itself had said. Cartoon Wars was specific about the writing methodology. Some of the interview comments were broader and cruder than that. MacFarlane also pointed out, with some justification, that targeting a writing staff whose members make less money than Stone and Parker had a particular quality to it. The writers of Family Guy were not Seth MacFarlane. They were people doing their jobs. The manatee joke made them all sound like interchangeable contributors to a mechanized process which, whether or not it was analytically accurate, was not the most elegant way to characterize a group of working television writers. Inside the Family Guy world, the response to Cartoon Wars was interesting in a different way. The writers started referring to their own cutaway gags as manatee jokes on the DVD commentaries. This is either charming self-awareness or evidence that they'd metabolized the criticism without changing their approach, depending on how you're reading it. Possibly both. There's something almost affectionate about it. A show saying to its critics, "Yes, we heard you, we found it funny, here's your turn back," while continuing to do the same thing. The in-show response came in 2009 in an episode called Spies Reminiscent of Us. Peter joins an improv comedy troupe. He's bad at improv in the conventional sense. He can't do character-based, present-tense scene work, but when he injects pre-written, out-of-context gags into the scenes, the audience goes wild. The other performer's character-based improv gets polite silence. Peter's manatee-style insertions get enormous laughs. The episode is Family Guy arguing, through comedy, that the South Park critique misses the point. The audience wants the gags. The gags are what work. The sophistication of narrative-based humour is a preference of the people making the comedy, not of the people consuming it. And there's something to that argument. I'll get to it in the section on the Steelman case for the show. What's interesting about MacFarlane's overall posture in the years after Cartoon Wars is how consistently he maintained a position of engagement without capitulation. He didn't dismiss the critique. He didn't fire back with his own attack on South Park. He sat with it, acknowledged what was accurate about it, and continued doing what he was doing. That's a reasonably sophisticated way to respond to criticism, and it's worth crediting him for it. He also made, in various interviews over the years, a point that I think has more merit than it usually gets acknowledged for. That Family Guy is primarily entertainment. That it is not trying to be South Park or The Simpsons. That the cutaway gag format is not a failure to achieve something more ambitious. It is the ambition. The show set out to make people laugh quickly, densely, repeatedly, and it succeeded at that. Measuring it against a standard it was never trying to meet is a kind of category error. This is a reasonable defence, and it's the same defence that a good stand-up comedian might make against being told their set doesn't have a coherent thesis. Not everything needs to be a structured argument. Sometimes the only goal is to make people laugh, and achieving that goal is its own justification. Where the defence gets complicated is over time. The question Parker and Stone were really asking wasn't, should Family Guy be more serious? It was, what can this approach sustain over 20 or 30 seasons? And that's a harder question to answer in 2006, when the show was only in its fourth post-resurrection season, than it is now, when we can actually see the answer. It would be genuinely unfair to spend this long going through the critique without giving the other side its proper due. And I want to do that honestly, not just as a token gesture toward balance. The legitimate defense of Family Guy starts with comedy history, because the non-sequitur gag has a distinguished lineage that predates Family Guy by a very long time. The Marx Brothers, Harpo Marx in particular. Harpo's sequences in films like Duck Soup and A Night at the Opera are structurally quite similar to what Family Guy does with its cutaways. They exist outside the causal logic of the film's narrative. They cannot change anything about the story, and yet they are funny in a way that is complete and self-sufficient. When Harpo pulls an improbable object from his coat, the joke isn't about the plot. The joke is about the specific surprise of that object appearing in that moment, in that context, from that person. It's a pure comedic event. Actually, there's a distinction worth drawing here between Harpo's gags and Family Guy's cutaways, which is that Harpo's gags happen to Harpo. He's still present. The logic of his absurdity is rooted in his specific character, the mute, anarchic, impossibly cheerful force of entropy that disrupts every scene he's in. His non-sequiturs are still character-generated in a strange way. They come from who Harpo is, which is someone for whom the normal rules of cause and effect simply don't apply. The cutaway gag in Family Guy doesn't even maintain that much connection to character. It literally cuts away from the character to show you something that isn't happening. But the absurdist tradition defense is still genuinely worth engaging with. The airplane comparison is the cleanest version of it. That film is almost entirely non sequitur, and it's considered a comedy classic for very good reason. The jokes come fast and don't care about narrative integration, and almost none of them have any consequence for the story. They just keep coming. And the cumulative effect of them all coming at the same high quality, in the same register, with the same comedic confidence, produces something that transcends the individual jokes. The whole becomes more than the sum of its parts, even when each part exists independently. The question is whether Family Guy achieves that same cumulative effect. And here, I think, the answer depends on which period of the show you're evaluating. In the best early seasons, the answer is sometimes yes. The jokes are consistent enough in quality and register that watching them assembles into something like a coherent comic experience. By later seasons, the diminishing returns of gag density without character foundation leave the cumulative effect much weaker. You end up with a lot of jokes and not much else. The argument then is that there is a legitimate comedic tradition of gag-based humour that does not require narrative integration to function. Family Guy sits in this tradition. The cutaway gags are not failed attempts at narrative comedy. They're successful attempts at something different. The road to episodes are the strongest evidence for the show's potential when it chose to engage differently. The Stewie and Brian road trip episodes, Road to Rhode Island, Road to Europe, Road to the North Pole, and others, are broadly considered the show's best work. And they're the best work specifically because they are focused on character. They follow Stewie and Brian through a sustained adventure, and the comedy emerges from how those two specific characters interact under stress. The jokes are funny because we know these characters. Their specific dynamic, Stewie's imperious impatience, Brian's world-weary pretension, the odd genuine affection that sits underneath their bickering, generates situations that couldn't happen to anyone else. These episodes suggest that Family Guy always had the capacity to do what Parker and Stone were arguing for. It just chose not to make that its primary mode. MacFarlane himself is a genuinely talented person. The musical numbers in Family Guy, another underappreciated element of the show, are often very well done. He has a real singing voice. The show's road to episode songs, the occasional show tunes pastiche, the elaborate musical set pieces. These are the work of someone who cares about craft in a specific register, even if that register isn't the one Parker and Stone most value. And the show's influence is undeniable. The cutaway gag format it popularized shaped a generation of comedy, for better or worse. Shows that came after Family Guy, including some very well-regarded ones, absorbed its structural DNA. The speed of the jokes, the willingness to break the frame, the culture of the non sequitur as a comedy delivery mechanism. These are Family Guy's contribution to the language of adult animation. None of this proves the manatee critique wrong, but it does establish that Family Guy was doing something that had real comedic legitimacy and real cultural impact, even if what it was doing wasn't what the people who hated it most would have wanted it to do. There's also a demographic argument worth taking seriously. The show's audience skewed young, college students, teenagers, people in their 20s watching it late at night on Adult Swim. For that audience at that moment, the rapid-fire gag format was genuinely the right format. It matched the rhythm of how that audience was beginning to consume media, in clips, in moments, in quick hits of entertainment, rather than sustained narrative. Family Guy, in this reading, wasn't failing to do something else. It was accurately reading an emerging shift in how people wanted to experience comedy. The timing of the show's resurrection coincides almost exactly with the emergence of viral video culture. YouTube launched in 2005. The idea that a funny moment could be extracted from its context and shared as a standalone thing was becoming the dominant mode of comedy consumption online. Family Guy's structure was, accidentally or not, perfectly suited for this new environment. Parker and Stone were defending a model of comedy where the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. Family Guy was building something where the parts were the whole, and the parts happened to be exactly what the internet wanted to spread. Whether that makes the show good by any craft standard is a separate question. But it does make it interesting as a cultural artifact. And it's worth noting that even Parker and Stone eventually made accommodations to this new reality. Later South Park seasons moved toward more topical, immediate humour, and the show launched a streaming platform that allowed episodes to be watched out of order, which rather undermines the argument for serialized continuity. The internet changed everyone's relationship to episodic television, not just Family Guy's. The Steelman case at its strongest is really this. Family Guy identified a real desire in a real audience, built a structure specifically to serve that desire, and did so with more craft and consistency than its critics usually give it credit for. The show is not accidental, it is intentional. The manatee metaphor describes a real methodology, but that methodology is chosen, not default. There's something to respect in a show that knows exactly what it is. Here's an interesting thing that happened to Family Guy around the mid to late 2000s. The internet turned it into a clip show. The cutaway gags worked perfectly for the emerging short video internet. YouTube launched in 2005, the same year Family Guy returned from cancellation. The format of the cutaway gag, self-contained, 30 seconds to 2 minutes, complete and funny in isolation, was exactly what got shared, clipped, rewound, linked. The chicken fight from season 4, the Stewie milking Peter monologue, various Peter being injured sequences, the Conway Twitty scenes, which circulated partly as a joke about the show itself. These things spread, but what this meant for the show as a show was instructive. When you watch a Family Guy episode as a complete 22-minute unit, it increasingly feels like a mechanism for delivering clips rather than a television episode in any meaningful sense. The connective tissue between the gags, the story, is there to move you from one gag to the next. The story is load-bearing infrastructure, not content. The Simpsons, by contrast, age differently in this same environment. Simpsons clips circulated too, of course they did, but you can also sit down and watch a Simpsons episode from season 4 or 5 as a coherent piece of television and find that it holds together. The story is part of the experience. The jokes work because you're watching these specific characters in these specific situations, and the context matters. The comparison with The Simpsons is particularly relevant because The Simpsons had by this point entered its own widely discussed period of creative decline. Zombie Simpsons became a term. The argument, similar in structure to the Family Guy critique, was that the later Simpsons had lost the character-rooted, emotionally coherent quality of the classic seasons and replaced it with a flashier, more fragmented approach. If anything, this period of Simpsons history made the Parker-Stone argument feel more urgent rather than less. When you see what a show looks like, when it loses its character foundations, it clarifies what those foundations were doing. Family Guy's ratings trajectory tells part of the story in numbers. The show launched to an enormous debut audience off the back of the Super Bowl. Peak seasons in the mid-2000s were drawing 10 to 12 million viewers. By season 15 in 2016, that had dropped to under 4 million on broadcast. The show continued, but it became a significantly smaller cultural object, sustained by the loyal audience it had and by the clip economy it fed, rather than by the kind of broad viewership it once commanded. The humour also shifted in a direction that the Parker-Stone critique, though not aimed at this specifically, turned out to be predictive about. Early Family Guy was edgy, but aimed its edginess broadly. It mocked pop culture, celebrities, historical figures, and the general absurdity of American life. Later seasons moved toward what critics sometimes call punching down, humour aimed at people or groups with less power, humour that was mean-spirited in ways that felt less like satire and more like license to be cruel. The Meg treatment is the most visible example, but it extended to the show's treatment of various marginalised groups in ways that aged poorly as cultural attitudes shifted. The punching down shift is itself a consequence of the structural problem. When you have a format that relies on shock and surprise, and you've exhausted the supply of genuinely surprising things to say about pop culture and history and absurdist scenarios, you start looking for the next thing that will create the sensation of transgression. And the next thing, for a show willing to go there, is often cruelty. Not because cruelty is inherently funnier than anything else, but because it still produces a reaction. Discomfort, surprise, a slight shock. When other things have stopped producing one, the shock is the point. The content of the shock is secondary. This is where Family Guy's critics who focused on the show's offensive content and Family Guy's critics who focused on the show's writing methodology actually converge. Parker and Stone were making a craft argument. The critics of the show's treatment of Meg or various minorities were making an ethical argument. But both arguments are pointing at the same underlying dynamic. A show that has abandoned structural constraint ends up wherever the next available reaction is, regardless of whether that reaction is worth pursuing. And then there's the American Dad comparison, which I find genuinely fascinating as an argument about cause and effect. American Dad is made by Seth MacFarlane. Same creator, same network, same broad creative ecosystem. It premiered in 2005, the same year Family Guy returned from cancellation, and it made almost the opposite structural choices. No cutaway gag structure, a full ensemble treated with consistent dignity, character-rooted comedy, genuine continuity. An American Dad, critically, and in terms of viewer satisfaction over time, has held up considerably better. This doesn't prove the manatee critique on its own. Lots of variables separate the two shows. But it is interesting that the creator who made the show Parker and Stone were criticising also made another show that embodied the approach Parker and Stone were defending, and that the second show turned out better. There's one more thing about how the critique aged that I think is genuinely important, which is the question of how each show handles its own best moments. Family Guy's best moments tend to be self-contained. The road to episodes, a particular chicken fight sequence, a Stewie monologue from season 2. These are islands of quality in a larger body of work. They don't accumulate. They don't build toward anything. They're appreciated individually as standalone things, which is fitting given the show's structure. South Park's best moments tend to be inseparable from their context. Scott Tenorman Must Die doesn't work if you watch it without understanding Cartman. Make Love Not Warcraft requires you to know these characters and find them funny on their own terms. The emotional gut punch of certain episodes, You're Getting Old, say, or the later season's serialized storylines requires investment accumulated over many seasons. The payoff is proportional to the investment. You get more out of it the more you've put in. That's the long-term difference. One model rewards casual consumption. One rewards sustained engagement. Family Guy built for the former and built it well, but in doing so, it foreclosed on the latter. You cannot have both simultaneously, and over 20 years, the choice shows. The zombie Simpsons argument is relevant here too. The phrase was coined to describe what happened to The Simpsons after its classic period. The idea that the show kept going after it had lost the qualities that made it worth going. The comparison to Family Guy is imperfect because Family Guy's decline was different in character from The Simpsons. The Simpsons declined gradually from a very high peak. Family Guy arguably never had that kind of peak. It was always primarily a gag machine, so its decline was less a fall from grace and more a long, slow diminishment of novelty. You can only be surprised by the same kind of randomness so many times before it stops surprising you. One more thought on the aging of the critique versus the aging of the defense. The Family Guy is just entertainment, and it works argument is an argument about the moment of watching. It's defending the experience of sitting down with a particular episode on a particular evening and finding it funny. That's a real experience. It genuinely happened to a lot of people. No argument dismisses it. The Parker/Stone critique is an argument about what accumulates over time. It's about the long view, what you have when 20 seasons have gone by, what the show has built, what it can produce that it couldn't produce in season 1. This is a different kind of argument. It's asking not, is this funny right now? But is this going somewhere? Family Guy's answer over 20 plus seasons is, not really. It's been funny in individual moments across all those years. It's made people laugh on many, many evenings. But it isn't substantially different in season 22 from what it was in season 5, except that the characters are more extreme versions of themselves, and the gags are less surprising because you've seen the format for 2 decades. The format can't go anywhere, because it was never designed to. The manatees keep selecting their balls, the machine keeps outputting, the show keeps going. There's nothing wrong with a show that does the same thing for a long time and keeps finding an audience for it. Lots of shows do exactly that. But it does confirm the specific worry Parker and Stone raised, that a comedy built on gag density and structural non-commitment can produce a very long run of television without producing what you'd call a body of work. It can fill 20 seasons of television without building toward anything that the 20th season couldn't have done in the 4th. That's a particular kind of success. Whether it's the kind of success worth having is, in the end, a question each viewer has to answer for themselves. The phrase character-based comedy gets thrown around quite a bit in discussions of this kind, and I think it's worth spending some time on what it actually means in practice, because it can sound like an abstract value, a preference dressed up as a principle, when in fact it refers to something fairly concrete and testable. Here's one way to test it. Can the joke only happen to this character, or could it happen to anyone? In South Park, the answer is usually this character. The reason Scott Tenorman Must Die, widely considered one of the show's best episodes, works is that every step of the story's escalation is rooted in who Cartman is. His pride, his cruelty, his specific inability to accept being made to look foolish, his willingness to go to extreme lengths for a perceived slight. All of these traits, established over multiple seasons, make the conclusion not just funny, but inevitable. The joke couldn't happen to anyone else. It couldn't even happen to a version of Cartman who didn't have this particular history. American Dad does this with Stan's paranoia. When Stan misreads a benign situation as a threat to national security, the comedy comes from who Stan is, a man trained to see the world as full of adversaries, who genuinely believes in what he's doing, who has no ironic distance from his own worldview. The joke is specific to him. You couldn't put another character in Stan's place and get the same result. And crucially, the joke also tells us something. When Stan mistakes a barbecue for a weapons test or treats a neighbourhood dispute as a classified operation, we laugh, but we also stand better for it. We've learned something about the shape of his mind, about how his training has deformed his perception of ordinary life. The joke has done double duty. It made us laugh, and it showed us something true. Roger's persona sequences work similarly. Roger is vain, self-dramatising, and incapable of accepting that his wants don't take priority. When he adopts a new identity, the comedy emerges from how these traits manifest in a new costume. Ricky Spanish, one of his recurring personas, who is apparently loathed by everyone in Langley Falls, for reasons the show gestures toward, rather than fully explaining, is funny, because we know Roger. We understand that Roger would create a persona, this despised and then be affronted, that people don't like him. There's a reason American Dad can sustain a long-running joke about Roger's personas, where each new persona is funny in its own right, while also being funny in relation to all the previous ones. The joke accumulates. Each new Ricky Spanish appearance adds to the history of Ricky Spanish. The audience's knowledge of Roger's character, built up over many seasons, is the substrate on which all these jokes run. Remove that substrate and the jokes still work, but they work less well. The familiarity is doing work. That's what character investment produces, a context in which jokes mean more than they would on their own. Now test a Family Guy cutaway with the same question. Can this joke only happen to Peter? Usually, no. The joke involves Peter's name and voice, but the joke itself is not about Peter's character. Peter winning a date with Gary Coleman in Mexico is funny in the way that any unexpected pairing of incongruous elements is funny. It doesn't require any knowledge of who Peter Griffin is. It would be equally funny if it happened to Brian or Lois, or to a character from a completely different show. This is not a moral criticism, it's a structural observation, and the structural difference matters because it explains why some shows can run for 20 seasons without feeling like they're repeating themselves. The character combinations are always specific. The situations are generated by the characters rather than applied to them, while other shows start to feel like the same episode rearranged after a while. There's another test related to the first. Can you remove the joke and have the episode still work? In a well-structured story, you can't remove key scenes without the logic collapsing. In a cutaway gag structure, you can remove any individual gag and the episode continues exactly as before. This is convenient for production. If a gag doesn't land in testing, it can be cut without ripples. But it also tells you something about the nature of the humour. It's modular, swappable, each piece independent of the others. The road to episodes are the counterexample within Family Guy itself, which is why they're consistently rated so highly by fans and critics. In those episodes, you can't remove sequences without the story falling apart, because the sequences are the story. Stewie and Brian's dynamic, their specific history, their specific tensions, their specific affection, is what generates the plot. The jokes emerge from the characters being who they are in specific circumstances, and the result is episodes that feel like they mean something, that leave you with something, that you remember not just as funny moments, but as complete experiences. What's worth understanding about the road to episodes is what they required from the writers. They required genuine commitment to two characters as characters, to knowing who Stewie and Brian are at a granular level, to understanding how they interact under pressure, to caring about the resolution of their relationship in a way that extends beyond what any given episode needs. The writers who worked on those episodes were doing something fundamentally different from what the Manatee Ball process produces. They were asking, what would actually happen if these two specific people ended up in this specific situation, and then following that question to wherever the honest answer led. The result is episodes that contain real comedy, but also real emotion. The closing sequences of some of the Road 2 episodes, where Stewie and Brian's relationship gets its full expression, are among the most genuinely moving things in Family Guy's entire run. The comedy didn't disappear, it was deepened by being in proximity to something that mattered. The laugh you get in those moments is a different kind of laugh, one that's connected to caring about the characters, which means it carries weight. The fact that these episodes exist and that the show clearly had the capacity to produce them is what makes the broader trajectory of Family Guy somewhat poignant when you think about it long enough. This wasn't a show that lacked the talent to do what Parker and Stone were arguing for. It was a show that had that talent and chose to use it selectively, reserving the character-driven approach for a specific subset of episodes, while the main body of the show ran on the manatee process. Why? The most honest answer is probably that the manatee process is easier to scale. Writing 22 episodes a season of character-driven comedy that maintains internal logic and builds on established histories is genuinely difficult. You can't do it by committee in the same way you can do gag assembly. It requires a smaller group of people working with deep familiarity with the characters. The road to episodes likely took more time and more creative care per episode than a standard cutaway-heavy installment. That ratio doesn't work as well when you're producing the volume of television that a long-running network show requires. The manatee argument, at its most generous interpretation, was an invitation to do more of that. Parker and Stone weren't asking Family Guy to become South Park. They were asking it to let its own best qualities do more of the work. There's a third test I find useful, beyond could this joke happen to anyone else? And can you remove this joke without affecting the episode? It's the question of what the joke reveals. A character-based joke reveals something about the character. It might confirm what we already suspected, or it might surprise us by showing us a side we hadn't seen before. But either way, when the joke ends, we know something we didn't know before. Something true about the character, about their psychology, about their relationship with the world. The joke has done work. It has added to the portrait. A pure gag reveals nothing. It's a transaction. You received a laugh and nothing else was exchanged. That's fine. Transactions are fine. But they don't accumulate the way revelations do. The character-based approach also gives comedy somewhere to go when the straightforward funny starts running dry. Every comic subject has limits. You can only make a certain number of jokes about Peter Griffin's stupidity before those jokes start feeling repetitive. But you can make jokes about how Peter processes his stupidity, about what it means to him, about how his self-image relates to his actual capacities, indefinitely. Because you're not mining the stupidity itself, you're mining the character's relationship to the stupidity. There's always more depth to find in a real character. There's a finite amount of funny in any specific trait. American Dad does this with Stan's conservatism. The show could have kept making the same "Stan is very conservative" jokes indefinitely. Instead, it explored what Stan's conservatism means to him, where it comes from, what it costs him, how it shapes his relationships. The conservatism is the texture of the character, not the joke. That distinction is what gives the show room to breathe across many seasons without feeling repetitive. Family Guy, by contrast, kept mining the same traits in the same ways, which is partly why long-time viewers often describe a sense of the show feeling like it's on a loop. The loop is structural. The format doesn't generate new depth. It can only generate new randomness, and randomness has diminishing returns. Family Guy is currently somewhere in its 23rd season, depending on when you're watching this. It has been on the air, with that interruption, in the early 2000s, since January 1999. That's a run that very few shows of any kind have matched. The show survived the cancellation. It survived the return. It survived the South Park critique and the flowers the Simpsons sent to the South Park offices. It survived Brian's death and Brian's resurrection. It survived a cultural shift in what audiences found acceptable, which required some genuine adaptation. Mike Henry's stepping down from voicing Cleveland Brown in 2020 being the most visible acknowledgement that some of the show's embedded choices needed addressing. Arif Zahir took over that role. Parker and Stone, in interviews as recently as 2018, reiterated that yes, they still dislike Family Guy. The animus hasn't softened over the years in any obvious way. MacFarlane still speaks of the Cartoon Wars episodes as funny and accurate. The positions have remained remarkably stable for nearly 2 decades. What's changed is the cultural context around the argument. In 2006, when Cartoon Wars aired, the idea that comedy should mean something or come from character could still be dismissed as the preference of a specific type of comedy nerd who was taking animation more seriously than it needed to be taken. The dominant conversation about adult animated shows was still largely about what they could get away with, how edgy they could be, how far they could push content, what subjects were off limits. The craft argument was present but secondary. Since then, the landscape has changed in ways that are worth appreciating slowly rather than rushing past. BoJack Horseman, which ran on Netflix from 2014 to 2020, is the clearest example of where character-driven adult animation eventually went. The show operated in a register that would have been inconceivable in the Family Guy model. It was genuinely sad. It dealt with addiction, depression, the long shadow of unaddressed trauma, and the way people avoid confronting themselves, all wrapped inside a comedy about a talking horse who used to be on a sitcom. None of this would work without deep investment in character. Every moment of genuine emotional impact in that show depends on everything that came before it. The structure of the show is the show. You cannot extract the funny parts from the sad parts because they are the same parts. The show Parker and Stone were critiquing in 2006 was not capable of producing something like BoJack Horseman. Not because the people involved weren't talented, they clearly were, but because the structural choices had been made in a direction that foreclosed that kind of depth. A manatee ball selection process cannot generate what BoJack Horseman was doing. The emotional weight requires a completely different kind of building. And in that context, the critique Parker and Stone were making in 2006 looks less like an eccentric aesthetic preference and more like an accurate description of what the medium was capable of and what Family Guy was choosing not to do. The strange irony of the whole story is that Cartoon Wars became, arguably, more famous and more frequently discussed than the Family Guy episodes it was parodying. The manatee image entered the vocabulary. People use it as shorthand. In comedy writing circles, in television criticism, in casual conversation about what makes jokes work, in ways that long outlasted the specific episodes that prompted it. American Dad has kept developing and attracting critical appreciation in ways that Family Guy has not. American Dad moved from Fox to TBS in 2014, a transition that could have been the end of it, and instead used the move as an opportunity to become more itself. Later seasons are generally considered better than earlier seasons. The ensemble grew, Roger's personas expanded into their own mythology. The show found ways to keep things fresh that Family Guy, by design, could not pursue. Seth MacFarlane made both of these shows, the same person. And the thing they reveal, in combination, is that the creative approach you choose shapes what your show can become over time. Family Guy chose the approach that maximised moment-to-moment laughs and minimised structural commitment. American Dad chose the approach Parker and Stone were defending. Both ran for decades. One of them not about MacFarlane's voice work, the genuine affection between Stewie and Brian, the show's willingness to do elaborate musical numbers, the comedy writing talent that was clearly in the room. These were real assets that the cutaway first format never fully deployed. There was a version of Family Guy that could have done something different with them. That version just wasn't the one that got made. There's something almost cozy about this whole story when you step back far enough from it. Two animated shows produced in the same decade on adjacent networks, aimed at broadly overlapping audiences, disagreeing about what comedy's supposed to be. One side saying, jokes are funnier when they come from somewhere, when they're rooted in specific characters with specific histories and specific ways of seeing the world. The other side saying, jokes are funnier when they surprise you, when they arrive from outside the story, when they exist purely for themselves without any obligation to mean anything beyond the laugh they generate. Both positions have genuine merit. Both have a tradition behind them. Both have produced things that are funny in different ways. What I find comforting about revisiting it all, and I do find it comforting, in the specific way that these late-night conversations about things that don't quite matter can be comforting, is that it's really an argument about what you want from entertainment. Whether you want it to leave you with something or just take you somewhere for a while. Whether a laugh that disappears without trace is as valuable as a laugh that's attached to something real about a character you've spent years with. And there's no single right answer to that. Some nights you want the thing that leaves you with something. Some nights you want something you can put on in the background and not have to invest in. Both are legitimate needs. Both are being served somewhere. The argument that Parker and Stone made was never really about Family Guy's audience. It was about creative choices and their consequences, about what a writing room decides to value and what that decision produces over time. And in 2006, they articulated something that most people in the industry agreed with, but weren't saying out loud. The flower since 1999. That's a remarkable thing. Seth MacFarlane made something that lasted. Whatever else you want to say about the structural choices, the longevity is real. But then, so is the manatee tank. And that's the thing about a good critique. It doesn't go away just because the subject of it keeps existing. I'll say one more thing before we wrap this up, which is that there's something I find genuinely interesting about the way this whole story illuminates the question of what comedy is for. Not just what makes comedy good, we've been circling that for 2 hours, but what comedy is actually doing in the world, what function it serves. If you think comedy's job is primarily to make you laugh in the moment, then Family Guy did its job. It made a lot of people laugh a lot of times. Some of those laughs were very good laughs. The show had moments of genuine comic brilliance that produced the kind of uncontrollable, slightly embarrassing reaction that you can't fake and can't plan for. That's real, that counts. If you think comedy's job is also to show you something true, about characters, about society, about human behaviour, about the way things work, then the structural choices matter in a way they don't if comedy is purely about the laugh. Because showing you something true requires building toward it. It requires establishing a world and then doing something specific within that world that only works because of everything that's been established. You can't show someone something true in a 30-second cutaway that's been randomly generated. You need the context, you need the history, you need the accumulated weight of people you've been watching long enough to actually know. You need, in other words, the thing that the manatees can't provide. Parker and Stone were making the second argument. Family Guy was embodying the first. Both remain available. Both have their adherents. And here we all are, 20 years later, still talking about it. No verdict required, really. The argument continues. The shows continue. Parker and Stone are probably still annoyed about it. MacFarlane is probably fine. If you want to see more of this kind of thing, long, easy wanders through television history, and the arguments people have had about it, I've got a few things planned. There's a whole video's worth of material in American Dad specifically, and another one in the broader story of what happened to The Simpsons, somewhere around season 9 or 10. We'll get there eventually. For now though, I hope that was a pleasant enough way to spend some time.